Man has gazed at the sky, at the stars, and dreamed of flight. In 1903, the Wright brothers showed it was possible. A quarter century later, Charles Lindbergh showed even vast oceans were no barrier. In 1947, Chuck Yeager proved man could even outrace the speed of sound. Then came the next great challenge.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
20 years ago this week, man stood poised to do just that.
We've just passed the 22-minute mark in the count, 21 minutes, 55 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control.
Hello, I'm Glenn Rinker. Welcome to Apollo 11, 20 years and counting. This is where America launched its dream to reach the moon, Launch Pad 39A. 20 years ago tonight, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first humans to walk on the lunar surface. Doesn't seem that long ago, does it? For the next hour, Channel 6 News NASA specialist Susan Cole and I will be looking back at those heady days of the space program.
We'll meet some of the people who worked on the Apollo program and relive the entire mission from launch to splashdown.
Plus, we'll see how the Space Coast has been changed by the space program and what might lie ahead. But first, the beginnings. It was not just good old American ingenuity that got us started on the path to the moon. Russian, German, and American scientists were racing to build a perfect rocket. And it was a German group that was building the most powerful ones. In the early 1930s, a group of ambitious scientists and technicians from European universities began experimenting on rockets on the Baltic peninsula of Peenemünde. In the beginning, they worked for science. As Nazism rose to power in Germany, they worked for Hitler. But through it all, they worked for and were inspired by a young German visionary named Wernher von Braun. The V-2s, or Vengeance weapons, were used by Hitler in World War II to bomb London. Von Braun, however, wanted to use these instruments of destruction to explore the heavens. As the war ended, 1,500 scientists and technicians joined the Soviets, but von Braun led 117 members of the Peenemünde group to the U.S. Army. They brought blueprints and designs, and with parts already captured by the Allies, they were able to build 100 V-2s. Some of von Braun's rocket experts wound up in White Sands, New Mexico, where they built and launched bigger and better V-2s. Later, many of them moved to Huntsville, Alabama to build a super V-2 called the Redstone. Cape Canaveral was chosen to be the test site for the powerful rocket, which would one day put man into space.
But you know, the first firing we had here, you wouldn't believe it. There were 52 people.
Carl Sendler, an Austrian by birth, is the last living member of the Peenemünde group here in Florida. He worked very closely with von Braun through the dangerous and often life-threatening metamorphosis of American rocketry.
I think he was one of the best men I ever met in my life. You know, because for one reason, quite often you find a good scientist, or you find a good manager, you know, a good politician who can sell something. Braun did everything.
Sendler also has fond memories of the other men he worked with, sometimes for stretches of 36 hours.
And we unloaded, we erected, we checked it out, you know, we had to do the troubleshooting, we fired it, we made the quick evaluation and sent it back to Huntsville or right after the shot. Did the whole thing. And I would say you probably cannot find this type of people anymore today because everything's so different, yeah?
And those coming from American colleges and universities who worked with the group from Peenemünde say the Europeans were instrumental in taking America from a rocket with 70,000 pounds of thrust to one that could produce 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The Saturn V.
The progress in developing the launch vehicle and getting into the heavy lift launch vehicles, as the Saturn was, I think we can attribute almost primarily to their influence.
And all through Apollo 11's countdown, von Braun was in the launch control room to oversee the fruits of his vision.
The Saturn V and its Apollo 11 crew sat on top of this mobile launcher, waiting to begin its historic journey. But the road to Apollo 11 was long, often filled with frustration, and sometimes tragedy. While America had its share of successes with the Redstone, it also had many devastating failures. And the nation was shocked when the Soviets launched their first satellite into space, Sputnik 1. Adding insult to injury, 1 month later they launched a second Sputnik and made a dog the world's first space traveler. America was not far behind, though. In 1958, we launched our first Earth satellite, Explorer 1. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was born, and 7 men were picked to be the nation's first astronauts. Unfortunately, a Soviet named Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. But by 1961, we did launch a chimp named Ham, and 5 months later, Alan Shepard became our first American spaceman.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
With that speech, the race to the moon began. With the Mercury program, NASA put man into Earth's orbit 6 times using specially designed one-man capsules. Then it rushed forward with Gemini, a 2-man spacecraft, which set the stage for the lunar missions. During the 10 Gemini flights, the astronauts took spacewalks, tested their endurance, and perfected rendezvous and docking techniques. All the while, Apollo 1 was being tested and readied for the first manned mission.
Yes, I don't know whether I should really say this or not, but Gus was a real great guy. A little small fellow, very feisty.
Penny Bowen was a good friend of Gus Grissom, who was assigned to that first launch atop a Saturn 1B. Just 1 week before the launch, the two met for drinks.
And he told me then that there were a lot of systems on the Apollo that were inferior to those that were on the Mercury and Gemini program. And he said he had talked to high-ranking people in both North American and with NASA. They wouldn't listen to him, and they told him that don't make any waves. And he told them, the way he told me, that, okay, there won't be any changes until somebody gets killed.
On January 27, 1967, Grissom's prediction became reality when he and 2 other astronauts lost their lives in a fire in their 3-man capsule. But America was not to be stopped. Over the next 2 years, NASA would launch almost a dozen manned and unmanned Saturn rockets. George Page was involved in all of those launches as the chief of spacecraft operations.
Those were very busy times for us because we were processing usually 3 sets of spacecraft at a time. I think on the first Saturn V, the first all-up Saturn V, which was Apollo 4, our first countdown demonstration test took 17 days. And that was because we had this problem, that problem, and we were learning. We were all learning, and the hardware was new to us.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth.
Astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders were the first to ride the huge Saturn V booster, leaving Earth's orbit to circle the moon. The next Apollo mission checked out the lunar module in Earth's orbit, and then came the big dress rehearsal, Apollo 10. Astronauts Cernan and Stafford traveled to within 50,000 feet of the lunar surface in a lunar module called Snoopy. It was also the first time Americans saw live color television from space.
How much we're going to progress in the future is left to your imagination. But if we harness our energies and keep our perspectives right, the goals are unlimited.
NASA really was an agency possessed, driven by a challenge to get to the moon.
It was, Glenn, and today many people say the agency needs another big challenge to rally support around the space program. And a little later on, we'll tell you about some of the changes NASA has gone through.
And when we come back, we'll look at the amazing rocket that got Apollo on its way.
And the 500,000 workers who made it all possible.
On a day when we celebrate man's first mission to the moon, we must also celebrate the rocket that got it off the ground. This Saturn V, laid to rest at the Kennedy Space Center, is a monument to space engineering. Each day, thousands of visitors get off their tour buses and marvel at the sheer size of this monster. It looks so powerless now, a shell of its former volatile self. But make no mistake about it, the Saturn V was the most powerful rocket ever built by man. The comparisons are endless. The Saturn V was as tall as a 36-story building, a 6 million pound Roman candle, 2/3 as tall as the Washington Monument. Most of all, it was a dependable workhorse fired 13 times with 13 successes. Its first stage weighed 148 tons before being fueled with 551,000 gallons of alcohol and liquid oxygen. That's enough to propel the craft at 6,000 miles an hour, 36 miles high. After 2 minutes 41 seconds, the first stage was discarded into the Atlantic. Then the second stage, with only 1/7 the power of the first, took the ship to 101 miles of altitude. It was discarded some 9 minutes after liftoff. Then the third stage kicked in for 145 seconds to get the ship in a circular orbit around Earth. Nearly 3 hours into the flight, it is fired up again for 6 minutes to get the crew headed toward the moon. It seems simple on paper, but the slightest error in trajectory or the malfunction of just one engine could have meant disaster for the crew and the space program.
I always had concern about them getting off because they didn't really have, they had everything self-contained, and the design of that had to work.
When its job was done and what was left of the Saturn V splashed down into the Pacific, 99.5% of its original weight would be gone. It would shrink from 36 stories high to 10 feet in length. The success of the Saturn V was not based on new technologies, just refining old ones, making successful rockets bigger and better.
Lunch here at Kennedy Space Center is less of a luxury these days. The men and women who labored on the Apollo project had little time for a leisurely break, and the work took its toll on them and their families. Apollo 11 was a credit to more than just those 3 men in the capsule. It was the triumph of the entire community of NASA workers and the people who worked for private aerospace companies.
You know he's always got an extra pack of cigarettes, roll up in his t-shirt.
They are the unsung heroes of the Apollo program, nearly 500,000 of them. Technicians, engineers, contractors, and construction workers. More than 5,000 of them virtually built Kennedy Space Center in 5 short years.
People that I worked with was a dedicated team. We were, by and large, fairly young with respect to some of the other type programs that go on, but we had a very small turnover in personnel because they had a real dedicated interest in finishing up what had been started.
Don Buchanan was one man responsible for turning America's concept for a mobile launch system into real hardware. An army of workers like him built one of the biggest buildings in the world at that time, the Vehicle Assembly Building, which would house the mighty Saturn V rocket. They created a mobile launch pad which could be recycled quickly and used over and over, and they designed a 6 million pound crawler transporter which would carry both the rocket and its mobile launcher out to the launch site.
They performed very well. So I had a very good team, and really couldn't have gotten a better one.
But while these men were putting in long hours at the Cape, building these structures and preparing their rockets, their families waited patiently at home.
Most of the disciplinary fell on the mothers back in those days because they were there 24 hours a day, and the fathers just weren't. So I guess we did the best we could.
Ann Hardcastle and thousands like her are also unsung heroes of the Apollo days. More often than not, they had to be both mother and father to the children.
Of course, back in those days, the guys were so busy. The women did carry a large part of the load, and it's changed a little bit now with the women being out in the workplace. But back in those days, most of the time, we stayed home and ran the household.
Ann's marriage was a happy one, but thousands of marriages during that period were not and ended in divorce.
In the year 25 25.
They have children of their own now, and many have followed their father's footsteps into the space business. But 20 years ago, they were the teenagers who didn't see much of their dedicated dads.
I think you can talk to just about anybody at this reunion, and their father was connected with the space program in one way or another. But I have to tell you that it was a real source of pride for all of us, and we knew the work was important and we knew it was historical.
Because so many of these 69 grads grew up in space families, it was easy for them to get caught up in the excitement of the times.
Always been connected with the space industry. I guess you call me a space brat. Always grown up with the rockets. I remember we used to go out in the backyard and watch them or be on a playground. It was missile, missile, missile.
I built a missile chair that was on a big post in our backyard, and it enabled me to lay back and see all the launches, but the Apollo 11 launch sticks out in my mind the most.
It doesn't look like much now, but on the morning of July 16th, 1969, this is where the eyes of those unsung heroes, and indeed much of the world, were focused. This was the tower at Launch Pad 39A. It's disassembled now, perhaps waiting someday to be put back together again as a national monument. This is where the mighty Saturn V rocket stood poised, 250,801 miles away from its target, the moon. This is where 3 men would blast off into space and into the history books. For the astronauts, the morning began as it did on the 5 previous Apollo launches. Breakfast in the crew quarters, suiting up, medical examinations, just another day. Hardly.
Good morning. It's T-minus 1 hour, 29 minutes, and 53 seconds, and counting in just an hour and a half. If all goes well, Apollo 11 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, are to lift off from Pad 39A out there on the voyage man always has dreamed about. Next stop for them, the moon.
Outside, more than 1 million people were gathering to witness the launch. There were what NASA called IIPs, incredibly important people, such as Vice President Spiro Agnew, senators, and dignitaries. Then there were the merely very important people, such as Jack Benny, Johnny Carson, and the well-connected. But most of us were just rams, raggedy-ass masses, NASA folks called them. Any countdown is an exciting experience, but this one, 28 hours long, had the added dimension of being the blast that would send man to the moon. At Flight Control in Houston, banks of computers monitored everything from onboard systems to astronaut respiration to communications and telemetry. Back at Cape Canaveral, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were headed for the Astrovan and onto the pad. Once there, Aldrin experienced what he would later call one of the most poignant moments of the mission. Armstrong and Collins were being strapped into the command module.
Watch the sunrise and watch the waves coming in moments before this giant Saturn was going to burst into action and propel us off. And it was a most memorable moment, looking out and seeing some evidence of the millions of people, and yet not any precise indication that there were that many people.
Waiting for the astronauts just outside the capsule was the leader of the closeout crew.
Gunnar Wendt, often known as the Pod Fuhrer, held his position with patience and perseverance.
You're more or less concentrating on getting done on time. I mean, that is such a driver, that getting done on time, that you really have very little time for emotions or for any other thoughts.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Then, precisely on schedule at 9:32 a.m. on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off into the bright blue Florida sky.
A perfect launch for what was actually a less than perfect mission.
There were some scary moments on Apollo 11. When we come back, we'll take you through each step of the mission, warts and all.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
some 20 years ago at the Kennedy Space Center that Apollo 11 was guided through a flawless 28-hour countdown.
But once the Saturn V cleared the tower, command of the mission went to Houston. That's where streams of data were being processed and where big decisions were being made.
Getting the spaceship off the ground was just the beginning of an 8-day mission, and all did not go as smoothly as the launch.
Good morning, starshine. The earth says hello.
4 days after launch, the Eagle separated from the command module, leaving Michael Collins alone, orbiting 45 miles above the surface. Back on Earth, the engineers and technicians who had worked on the lunar module watched anxiously.
We knew that this one was going to the moon and that the astronauts were involved in it, and we wanted to make sure that everything was right. I mean, it had to be right.
The lunar module team had been plagued by a seemingly endless number of technical problems. Structural cracks, broken wiring, and a serious weight problem. And they couldn't be absolutely sure it would work. They couldn't rehearse a lunar liftoff because of the difference in gravity between the Earth and the Moon. Simulations in a crude early version of the LEM often ended with Neil Armstrong ejecting just before it would have crashed. Still, they had faith in this gawky spider-like spacecraft and waited anxiously for the big moment.
1,400 feet, still looking very good.
Nerves were stretched as Armstrong and Aldrin prepared for descent. They were traveling 15 miles per hour faster than planned, and then an overtaxed computer sent out alarms to the crew. Mission Control had to act fast.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. 1201 alarm. Same type, we're go, flight. Okay, we're go. We're go, same type, we're go.
The decisions were made on a rapid basis. We, the people in Mission Control, the support rooms, were able to bring that confidence to bear from the test, and confidence in the equipment, confidence in the employees. We've done one great job.
Then another problem. The Eagle was 4 miles west of its planned touchdown point. Armstrong took the controls, rapidly running out of fuel.
That didn't really particularly worry me at that point in time. We were used to flying the lunar landing training vehicle with very low amounts of fuel, very few number of seconds left before touchdown. And at that point, we were at a low enough altitude that probably if we'd had fuel exhaustion, the landing gear was capable of the fall.
Finally, with less than 17 seconds of fuel left, history was made.
We copy you down, Eagle. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
A little more than 6 hours later, an estimated 500 million people worldwide watched a fuzzy, ghost-like image on television as Neil Armstrong climbed out of the lunar module and into the history books.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Buzz Aldrin soon joined Armstrong on the lunar surface, and together they planted a U.S. flag in the soil, a flag that had been stiffened with wire to make it appear driven by wind. They collected 47 pounds of moon rocks and set up experiments to detect solar wind and moonquakes. Then, after 135 minutes of walking on the moon and another 19 hours in the lunar module, it was time for the journey home.
You had to separate from the ascent stage from the descent stage. And so you worried about some of the things on separation, that nothing would hang up, that when the guillotine would work properly, and that they would take off and everything would burst flying that way.
7 minutes after liftoff from the moon and a bumpy docking with Columbia, the Eagle was safely back in lunar orbit, and the crew was reunited for the long trek back to Earth. 3 astronauts, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, traveled to the moon and back, stopping briefly to unlock some mysteries of the lunar surface and fulfilling the dream for which so many Americans had worked so hard.
When we come back, we'll look at how the Space Coast has changed since those glory days of Apollo.
And how Apollo 11 played in the media when there were a lot of other important stories going on.